January 17, 1945, South China Sea, 08:47 hours. The water stretched like hammered steel beneath a colorless sky. Lieutenant Commander Hideaki Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the destroyer Akebono, watching the convoy cut through the gray Pacific swells. 12 cargo ships, 4 escorts, enough fuel and ammunition to keep the crumbling garrisons in Indochina fighting for another 3 months. The wind carried salt and diesel fumes. Behind him, a young ensign adjusted the radio headset, his fingers trembling slightly in the cold. Yamamoto did not tremble. He had survived Midway, survived the Marianas, survived the long retreat that had turned the Imperial Navy from conqueror to guardian of supply lines no one believed could be protected anymore. He lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in his cupped hands, and allowed himself a moment of contempt for the enemy pilots who had failed to find them in 2 days of searching. American pilots. Cowboys in machines built by Detroit assembly lines. Men who learned to fly in 6 months what took a Japanese aviator 3 years to master. The Americans had numbers, yes, they always had numbers. But numbers without discipline were just noise, just waste. He exhaled smoke into the wind and watched it vanish. He did not yet know that 600 miles to the northeast, a single P-51 Mustang had just lifted off from a forward airstrip in Luzon, its pilot nursing a damaged radio and flying a route no one had authorized. To understand what happened in those waters requires understanding what the Japanese Navy had become by the winter of 1945, and what it had once been. 4 years earlier, in the intoxicating months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been the finest naval force in the Pacific, perhaps in the world. Its carrier pilots were samurai of the sky, men who had trained for a decade, who could put a bomb through a smokestack from 12,000 feet, who flew with a precision that made American observers speak in whispered admiration. The Zero fighter was lighter, faster, more maneuverable than anything the United States could field. Japanese torpedoes ran true and deep. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggression, night fighting, the kind of close-quarters brutality that American commanders feared and respected. But 4 years of war had bled that Navy white. The carriers were gone, sunk at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf. The pilots were gone, the irreplaceable veterans lost over coral atolls whose names no one in Tokyo could pronounce. What remained in early 1945 was a shadow force. Destroyers with empty fuel tanks, submarines that could not dive for lack of spare parts, and cargo convoys that hugged coastlines like frightened children, hoping to slip between the American patrols that now owned the Pacific. The men who served on these convoys were not the elite anymore. They were the clerks, the mechanics, the boys who had been in middle school when the war began. They had been told their entire lives that Japanese discipline, Japanese spirit, Japanese willingness to die would overcome American materialism. They had been told that Americans were soft, that they relied on machines because they lacked courage, that when the war became truly hard, the Americans would sue for peace and return to their jazz music and their Hollywood fantasies. Yamamoto had believed this once. Most of them had. But belief erodes under bombardment. The Mustang. The P-51D Mustang that lifted off from Luzon that morning carried the name Prairie Fire stenciled beneath its cockpit. Its pilot was Captain William Bill McKinley Porter, 24 years old, from a town in Kansas so small it did not appear on most maps. Porter had been a crop duster before the war, flying rattletrap biplanes over wheat fields for $11 a day. He learned to fly low, to read wind in the way grass moved, to navigate by instinct when fog rolled in and instruments were useless. The Army Air Forces taught him to fly fighters, but they did not teach him the thing that mattered most. They did not teach him to see the world from a cockpit the way a hawk sees a meadow. Everything rendered in patterns of movement and shadow and vulnerability. Porter was not supposed to be flying that morning. His squadron had flown a bomber escort mission the day before, 8 hours in the cockpit, and the rotation schedule gave him 24 hours down. But his Mustang had taken flak over Formosa, nothing serious, a few holes in the tail section, damage to the radio. And Porter insisted on test flying the repairs himself. He did not trust mechanics. It was not personal. He simply understood that a pilot who did not know his own aircraft intimately was a pilot who would die stupidly. The test flight was supposed to last 30 minutes. Porter climbed to 15,000 feet, checked the control surfaces, ran the engine through its paces. Everything responded. The radio crackled with static and then went dead. Still damaged, then. But Porter had flown with worse. He banked south, intending to return to base. And that was when he saw them. 12 ships. 4 escorts, cutting through the South China Sea in a tight formation that spoke of fear and discipline in equal measure. Porter circled once, high enough that the ships would register as a speck if they saw him at all. He checked his fuel. Enough for 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours if he throttled back. He checked his ammunition. 6 50 caliber machine guns, 1,400 rounds total, and 4 5-inch rockets under the wings. He thought about the radio, about the fact that no one knew where he was, about the regulations that said a lone fighter did not engage a convoy without support. Then he thought about the men in those ships, the ammunition they carried, the garrisons they would supply, the American and Filipino soldiers who would die because those supplies got through. He nosed the Mustang into a shallow dive and began his approach. The mockery. On the Akebono, the radar operator picked up the contact at 12 miles. A single aircraft, inbound, medium altitude. The report went to Yamamoto, who studied it with the flat calm of a man who had seen every variety of disaster. 1 aircraft. Not a scout. Scouts flew higher. Not a bomber. Bombers came in groups. A fighter, then. Probably lost or damaged, looking for targets of opportunity before limping home. Sound alert condition, Yamamoto ordered. Anti-aircraft crews to stations. The alarm rattled through the ship, a sound like gravel in a tin can. Men scrambled to their guns, the 25mm mounts, the 13mm machine guns, weapons that had been modern once and were now obsolete, maintained by sheer force of will and scavenged parts. The gunners were boys, most of them, trained in a week and sent to war. They stared at the sky, searching. On the cargo ships, officers barked orders that were half ritual. There was a bitter comedy to it, this pantomime of defense. The convoy had no air cover. The last Japanese fighters in the region had been pulled back to defend Formosa, leaving the sea lanes naked. The ships had no armor to speak of, no watertight compartments that would survive a bomb hit. If the Americans came in force, the convoy would die. Everyone knew this. But one fighter? One lone American cowboy? A petty officer on the Akebono spacked over the rail and said something that made the men near him laugh. It was not recorded, that comment. But a dozen survivors remembered the laughter. They remembered the sense of relief, even contempt. One fighter. What could one fighter do? They were about to learn. The first pass Porter came in from the sun, a tactic so old it had been used in the previous war. But old tactics worked because physics did not change. The sun blinded the lookouts for the 3 seconds that mattered. He dropped to 2,000 feet, leveled out, and opened fire on the lead cargo ship. The 50 caliber rounds did not sound like gunfire from the receiving end. They sounded like a hammer hitting a steel drum, impossibly fast, impossibly loud. The bullets walked across the ship's superstructure, shredding radio masts, punching through the thin plating of the bridge, killing the helmsman and the captain in a spray of metal and glass. The ship lurched, its rudder locked, and began a slow turn to port. Porter pulled up, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat, and banked hard left. Tracers followed him, bright against the gray sky, but they were slow, badly aimed. He had expected this. Japanese anti-aircraft fire had been deadly in 1942, but the men who knew how to lead a target were mostly dead now, and the boys replacing them had been given guns and prayers. He climbed to 3,000 feet and circled, assessing. The lead ship was turning, already out of formation. The escorts were converging, trying to put themselves between the convoy and the threat. But they were moving too slowly, their formations too rigid. Porter could see the pattern of it, the way a chess player sees the board 3 moves ahead. He nosed down again. The reality of abundance. The thing the Japanese could not understand, the thing their intelligence officers noted in reports but never truly grasped, was that America did not build weapons the way other nations did. American factories did not craft fighters with care and artistry. They stamped them out like automobiles, like refrigerators, like the 10,000 identical objects that rolled off assembly lines in Detroit and Los Angeles and Wichita every single day. The P-51 Mustang was not a work of art. It was a solution to an engineering problem, and the solution was build it fast, build it tough, build it in such numbers that losing one did not matter. Porter's Mustang had been assembled in 6 weeks. Its engine had interchangeable parts. Its guns could be reloaded by a crew of 3 men in under 10 minutes. If Porter crashed it into the ocean that morning, another Mustang would replace it by afternoon. And another pilot, there were always more pilots, would fly it the next day. The Japanese built their weapons like swords, each one a masterpiece, each loss a tragedy. The Americans built their weapons like hammers, and they had so many hammers that they could afford to break them. This was not a moral difference. It was not a question of courage or spirit. It was a question of industrial capacity, of natural resources, of an economic system that could produce more steel in a month than Japan produced in a year. The Imperial Navy had been fighting a nation that could absorb losses the way an ocean absorbs rain, and no amount of Bushido could change mathematics. Porter did not think about any of this. He thought about the deflection angle, the wind speed, the way the destroyer's wake curved through the water. He fired his rockets. The sinking. The first rocket missed, detonating 50 yards ahead of the destroyer's bow, throwing up a plume of white water. The second rocket struck amidships, punching through the hull plating and exploding inside the engine room. The blast killed 14 men instantly and ruptured the steam lines. Superheated vapor filled the compartment, and the men who were not killed by the explosion were boiled alive. The destroyer Akebono began to list. Yamamoto felt the deck tilt beneath his feet and knew immediately that his ship was dying. There was no drama to this knowledge, no surge of emotion. He had seen too many ships die. He grabbed the rail and shouted orders that no one could hear over the alarms and the screaming, and then he stopped shouting because there was no point. The list increased. 10 degrees, 15. The water was rising. Porter made another pass, strafing the second escort, and then a fourth pass, targeting a cargo ship that had broken formation and was trying to run for the coast. His ammunition was running low. His fuel gauge showed 30 minutes remaining. He should disengage, should climb and head for base. But the convoy was scattering now, panicking, and scattered ships were easy targets. He made 2 more passes. He destroyed a cargo ship carrying aviation fuel, and the explosion lit the sky like a second sun, black smoke boiling upward in a column visible for 30 miles. He damaged another escort badly enough that it would sink before nightfall. He expended his last ammunition on a cargo ship that stubbornly tried to maintain course, and he saw men jumping from the deck into the freezing water, saw the ship settle by the stern and begin its slide beneath the waves. Then his fuel light came on, and he had no choice. He climbed to 10,000 feet, set a course for Luzon, and left the convoy burning behind him. The survivors. Yamamoto went into the water when the Akebono rolled onto her side. The sea was shockingly cold, and the fuel oil on the surface burned his eyes. He swam away from the ship, away from the suction that would pull him down when she sank, and found a piece of debris to cling to. A wooden hatch cover, splintered but buoyant. Around him, men screamed and drowned and prayed. Some called for their mothers. Some sang the national anthem until the water filled their lungs. Yamamoto did not scream. He clung to the hatch and watched his ship slip beneath the surface, and he thought about the fighter that had done this. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot. He had seen the Mustang on every pass, had seen the way it moved, not gracefully, not artfully, but with a kind of brutal efficiency that made grace irrelevant. The pilot had not been showing off. He had been working, methodically destroying targets, and when his work was done, he had left. This, Yamamoto understood, was what they were fighting. Not an enemy that relied on spirit or tradition or the willingness to die. An enemy that treated war like a job, like a problem to be solved, with tools and repetition, and the absolute certainty that there would always be more tools. He floated in the oily water for 4 hours before a fishing boat picked him up. By then, 6 ships had sunk. 3 more were damaged beyond repair. The convoy that was supposed to supply Indochina for 3 months had been reduced to wreckage and smoke by a single pilot in a single fighter. When Porter landed at Luzon, his fuel tanks were dry enough that the ground crew could hear them slosh when they tilted the wings. He climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cold, and walked to the debriefing tent. He filed a report, engaged enemy convoy, expended all ammunition, probable sinking of 3 vessels, damage to 4 more. The intelligence officer who took the report raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Lone fighters did not sink convoys. But the next day, reconnaissance flights confirmed the wreckage, and the day after that, radio intercepts picked up Japanese transmissions ordering the cancellation of supply runs through that sector. Porter was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He did not keep it. He sent it home to his mother, who put it in a drawer and never mentioned it to anyone. The story might have ended there, another minor engagement in a war full of minor engagements, except that a war correspondent heard about it and wrote a piece that ran in stars and stripes. The piece was titled, "One Man, One Mustang," and it turned Porter into a minor celebrity, the kind of hero the American public loved, modest, competent, from a small town, the sort of man who did impossible things and then went back to work. But the Japanese survivors told a different story. In the prisoner of war camps, in the hospital ships, in the quiet conversations among officers who were trying to make sense of defeat, the story of the convoy became a parable. Not a parable about American heroism, but about American abundance. One fighter had destroyed a convoy because America could afford to send one fighter, because America had so many fighters that risking one did not matter. The pilot had not needed to be brilliant. He had needed to be competent and well supplied, and competence plus supply equaled victory. This was a bitter lesson, but it was the truth. The ideology of plenty. The young ensign who had stood beside Yamamoto on the bridge of the Akebono survived the sinking. His name was Kenji Tanaka, and he spent the rest of the war in a hospital in Manila, recovering from a shattered leg. The Americans who ran the hospital gave him morphine for the pain and sulfa drugs for the infection, and 3 meals a day that were more food than he had seen in a month aboard ship. The nurses were kind. The doctors were efficient. No one beat him. No one interrogated him. Tanaka had been taught that Americans were decadent, that they were weak because they were comfortable, that comfort bred cowardice. But the men who treated him were not cowards. They were simply men who had enough food, enough medicine, enough resources, that they did not need to choose between healing a wounded enemy and healing their own. This abundance was not an accident, it was not luck. It was the product of a system that Tanaka did not fully understand, a system built on principles that his teachers had dismissed as selfishness and greed. But the system worked. It produced food and steel and aircraft, and men who flew those aircraft, with the calm certainty that if they died, someone else would take their place. Tanaka returned to Japan after the war. He became an engineer, helped rebuild a country that had been burned to ash. He married, had children, lived a long and unremarkable life. But he never forgot the hospital in Manila, the abundance that had spared his life. He never forgot the Mustang. The symbol. In the years after the war, the P-51 Mustang became a symbol, not just of American air power, but of the American approach to conflict. It was not the best fighter in the war. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 had better high-altitude performance. The British Spitfire was more beloved by its pilots. The Japanese Zero, in the hands of an expert, could outturn anything the Allies built. But the Mustang was good enough, and there were enough of them, and that combination, good enough and enough, was what mattered. But that pilot, he was not weak. He was not even particularly angry. He was just doing his job, and when his job was finished, he left. That was the most frightening thing. Not that he destroyed us, that he did it so casually, as if we did not matter. He paused, and the journalist waited. "We were supposed to be samurai," Yamamoto said. "But they were plumbers, and plumbers fix problems. They do not care if the pipe fights back." The interview was never published, but the reporter kept the notes, and after Yamamoto died, the notes found their way into a university archive, where they sit now, yellowed and fragile. A testament to the day a single fighter destroyed a convoy and proved that ideology could not stop steel. The sky above the South China Sea is empty now. The wrecks have rusted away, their iron and aluminum dissolved into the water, feeding algae that feed fish, that feed the living. But the story remains, a ghost story, told in steel and fire, about the moment when the old world of warrior honor met the new world of industrial arithmetic and learned, too late, that numbers do not care about courage. They only care about themselves.